Vive la France! What do you reckon? Pretty good. No? In the last few years, the far right have been on what seems like an unstoppable march across Europe and beyond. Take your pick, guys. Been pretty bleak. Germany, let's be honest, not a country which has come to terms with its past. The AfD, the far right, are in second place. In Italy, the heirs to Benito Mussolini run the place. In Austria, they're on course to win the election later this year. Spain and Portugal seem to be immune to the far right epidemic for a long time. But then far right parties emerged there with big support as well. And so it proved for France as well. The far-right National Rally have surged under their figurehead, Marine Le Pen, and the polls suggested they were on course to win the legislative elections this weekend. This did not happen. Instead, they came third. Oopsie daisy. They were defeated by a left-wing alliance, which came first, whose most prominent figurehead is the radical leftist Jean-Luc Mélenchon. Now, for a British audience, this alliance was a bit like Jeremy Corbyn allied to the Green Party and Ed Miliband. Now, the programme they stood on was unashamedly social democratic, in contrast, it must be said, to Keir Starmer's offer here in the UK, including taxing the rich, public investment, reversing a tax on pensions, hiking public sector wages, and so on. Now, as we will discuss, this is not a time for complacency, but there are huge lessons in France for Britain and beyond. What is frankly beyond galling is watching centrist types in Britain try and claim this victory as their own and as a victory for Emmanuel Macron himself. One former BBC journalist tweeted about the result, an absolutely huge shock and delight for Macron, who can argue his gamble paid off. To which I respond, WTF. Now, to be clear about what happened here, Emmanuel Macron called a legislative election, which was completely unnecessary after his centrist party Renaissance got a kicking in the European elections. He did so expecting the French left to be fragmented and divided, thinking that would force the electorate in France to treat this as a straight choice between his so-called centrists and the far right. Given his disapproval ratings is hovering among between 2/3 and 3/4, this was a slightly unfortunate gamble. What actually happened is the fragmented left defied the expectations and got their act together. So Mélenchon's France Unbound, the rump of the old Socialist Party, the Greens, the Communists, and others formed an alliance actually within about 24 hours, the New Popular Front, record time. Mélenchon correctly has declared that the French Republic was saved by the left, la gauche, not by Macron, who nearly, frankly, caused catastrophe. Now let's hear Mélenchon standing in Stalingrad Square, brimming with thousands of French leftists as they sing the Internationale.
Qu'au motif que je me présente devant tous, j'aurais oublié d'où je viens et qui je suis, et quelle est ma patrie dans le temps, alors ce jour anniversaire de la Commune de Paris, c'est à nous maintenant, pour ceux qui la connaissent, d'entonner à la mémoire des nôtres, morts pour la liberté, l'Internationale. Debout les damnés de la terre.
The Internationale unites the human race. Amen. Now, Macron's brand of so-called centrism paved the way for the far right in lots of different ways. And it really goes to show that the so-called horseshoe theory, that the so-called extremes of left and right are morally equivalent, is a load of self-serving shit. This rot didn't start when Macron became president in 2017. I mean, we should look actually 5 years earlier, when Francois Hollande took the presidency of France, promising to break with austerity. No such thing happened, and Hollande shattered the Socialist Party as a consequence. In fact, they nearly collapsed entirely as a political force. He appointed Macron as his finance minister about 2 years in. He was attached to a right-wing economic policy. But when Macron became president in 2017, the so-called centrists in Britain and elsewhere treated it like Christmas on steroids. Macron is the antidote to the right-wing populist virus. That was the New European in May 2017. Very excited. Now Macron can help Europe win the war against populism. That was Mathieu Lane, advisor to Macron in May 2017, writing in The Guardian. Macron, the populist antidote to populism, subheading France's leader came to power on a tide of change and is best placed to tackle the nationalism taking hold in Europe. That was Philip Collins, not Phil Collins, the singer, the speechwriter for Tony Blair and also for Keir Starmer back in May 2018. Emmanuel Macron offers the populist antidote to nationalism. That was Philip Stevens, former head of the Financial Times editorial board. Rebranding the centre, Obama backs Macron cast as populism slayer in France elections. That's CBC News in May 2017. What actually happened? Narrator, not that. When Macron won power, the far right had just 6 seats in the French legislature. Sorry, 8 seats. They'd gone up by 6 seats in that election. So they had about 8 seats. 5 years later, they won 89 seats in the French legislature. This week, the far right won 142 seats. Not what I'd call a great record in smashing the far right. In fact, the far right have boomed and thrived under Macron. What happened there then? Well, for a start, Macron pursued a strategy of responding to the far-right surge by taking on their rhetoric and slightly watered-down versions of their policies. Indeed, France is where the horseshoe theory goes to die. Macron's strategy for defeating the far-right menace adopts their rhetoric and slightly diluted versions of their policies. After first securing the presidency, he clamped down on asylum seekers. More recently, he drove through an immigration bill which, among other things, restricted social security entitlements to migrants, made it harder to bring over loved ones, and stopped giving automatic citizenship to children born on French soil to foreign parents. His government railed against the so-called Islamist Hydra and Islamist separatism, and his government portrayed any form of Muslim religiosity as a menace, while Macron himself denounced woke culture. Now, all of this was wrong in principle, but it didn't do what it was supposed to do. It merely legitimised the far right, shifting the political conversation onto the terrain they thrive in and leading Le Pen to accurately describe all of this as an ideological victory, thus putting more wind in her sails. Now, it goes beyond that. Now, as the France-based journalist Cole Stangler tells me, Macron pursued unpopular economic policies that have hurt working class people and favoured the well-off, fueling resentment that the far right has been able to capitalise on. It's true that in the end, many of Macron's centrist so-called alliance stood down in the second round of parliamentary elections for leftist candidates in a Republican front to head off the far right, but the damage done by left bashing was done. Just 43% of French Macronists voted for Mélenchon's bloc to stop Le Pen's party in the second round, with the fifth opting for the far right, while 72% of Mélenchists opted for Macron's vehicle to do the same. Now, what prominent Macronistas did is equate the left with the far right. So, for example, Bruno Le Maire, who's the finance minister under Macron, he savaged France and bowed Mélenchon's party movement as being a danger to the Republic alongside the far right. So he was saying they were equivalent. And the left was savaged as being a cesspit of anti-Semitism, even though they were up against a national rally which is defined by racism. Does that sound familiar? Yes, well, quite. As you can see, the horseshoe theory claim is just risible nonsense. It's the so-called centrists who took on board, who adopted the rhetoric and policies of the far right. They're the ones who paved the way for the far right and their policies, which drove economic insecurity, which the far right feed on. And it was the left who blocks the path of the far right after Macron nearly handed them the Republic on a platter. There's so much to learn from because our Macron is Keir Starmer. Indeed, we should know that in Germany, it was Olaf Scholz of the German Social Democrats who came to power in late 2021, forming a coalition with very similar politics to that of Keir Starmer, but failing to tackle the growing crises within German society. The far right grew instead. Joe Biden was supposed to be the grown-ups taking over in 2020, finally laying Trumpism to rest. Well, I don't really need to discuss that, do I? So the bet amongst the centrists is that Starmer will be different. Even as, for example, there's a £20 billion a year black hole in Britain's finances, which needs to be filled just to stand still in our current dire state, which is public services falling apart. And that's without mentioning an ageing population, for example. But Labour's kept the Tories' fiscal rules and ruled out the tax hikes on the rich we need to fill the gap. Indeed, the Labour offer is exceptionally thin, even though Britain is in a far worse state than in France when Macron took over in 2017. We can also anticipate Starmer responding to the rise of reform by doing the same sort of migrant bashing that Macron indulged in, with the same results as in France. So here's a warning to us in Britain, because here we have Farageism, and reform came second place in 98 seats, 89 of them held by Labour, ready to take them, to sweep in at the next election. But the Greens are also behind Labour now in dozens of seats. So here's what I think we need. In Parliament, the Labour left, the Greens and the new left-wing independents need to work together in a progressive caucus, for example. The Labour left MP should now be much more emboldened. After the independent success and the Green success, they'll be less likely to be purged. Do they really want Labour MPs defecting to the Greens, for example, and boosting their profile and relevance, lifting the Greens' vote share nationally and therefore threatening other MPs? Doesn't strike me as a good idea, but, they should fill the boots. That could be our new popular front in any case. But everything needs also to be thrown at the dozens of seats where the Greens came a solid second behind the Labour Party, like in Bristol Central before the last election. The Greens were second behind Labour in the nominal boundaries after the 2019 election, but it's very considerably behind. But they got a 28-point swing and took the seat from Labour in this election. The same can happen here. But if the left don't get their act together in the UK, then the right will. In France, the far right could still take power. There's a deadlocked parliament, they'll exploit that. So there's a lesson and a challenge for all of us. And whether we take that on or not, well, do we want to stop the far right or not? I'd prefer to. Please like and subscribe. Do leave your comments, love to hear your thoughts. Help us keep the show on the road as we chart the political tumult of the coming weeks, months and years on patreon.com/OJOS84. Listen to the podcast. I'll speak to you soon.